Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Moin Mir is a writer. He's living in London. He is writing fiction and non-fiction. He is very knowledgeable in Sufi poetry, and he is a great traveler. And his main interests are literature, history, and philosophy. I said he's a traveler. He's an obsessive traveler. Tell me why.
I think because what I see, what I experience when I'm putting myself out there in a space where I'm immersing myself, every pore of myself in history and the great works of the philosophers that can be read within historical environments. I experience a sense that I would never experience just being closeted at home. So getting myself out there, putting myself in the footsteps of some of the finest philosophers, some of the finest poets, writers, artists, it invigorates and injects a sense of curiosity that I get only when I'm on the road, when I'm traveling, when I'm learning, when I'm seeing, and my senses are constantly being evoked. And that happens only when one travels.
And where do you travel?
Well, actually, I must admit, the person that organizes our travels is my wife. And so we travel all over India. We travel to parts of India which usually many people don't really go to, which are in the interiors. For example, the villages in Gujarat, which have been a point of great inspiration for me. We travel extensively within Europe. We spend a lot of time in Puglia. We spend vast amount of time in Rome, in the countryside in England. I would have loved to have gone to Iran and Afghanistan, but unfortunately, the political situation is such.
Because, by the way, you are fluent not only in English, obviously, which is the language, your language as a writer, right? You write your books in English, but you speak fluently Urdu.
That's right.
And Persian, right?
That's right.
But
yeah.
Why? Because of your family, because of your grandfather, who somehow was your mentor, the one who taught you about the Sufi world and philosophy and religion. I mean, is it that?
That's right. Well, we trace our ancestry to a very small village, which is on the borderlands of Iran and Afghanistan. And it's a small village called Chisht, which now finds itself in Herat. And Herat is now in Afghanistan. But in the grand sweep of history, 150 years ago, Herat was pearl of the Khorasan. It was the pride of Iran. So we moved.
So you're not Indian.
Well, we've been in India for a couple of hundred years. So yes, Indian in the fact that we've been there for so long. But we always kept Farsi alive because that's the language my great-grandfather spoke. Urdu was spoken because it became a language of court, if you wish, in the twilight of the Mughal Empire. And it became a language which reflected this fantastic mosaic that was India, because Urdu is 60% Farsi, 20% Arabic, and another 20% Hindi. So that language emerged in the 18th century and became the last court language of Delhi, so to speak. So these are the two languages that we spoke, and we kept them alive. What many people don't realize is that Persian was the official language of India till 1857. And that's not very long ago. In fact, till the early 1900s, if you had to transact in India, buy and sell property, the official documentation would first be in Urdu and then in Farsi.
You are Muslim.
Yeah.
That's also for the other ones, for the Hindi, or just for the Muslim world?
No, it was the official language of India. Urdu itself was a court language. So it was not only for Muslims. Some of the finest Urdu poets have been Hindus. Some of the most exquisite poetry that has come out in terms of mystical poetry, as well as prose, in Urdu, are from Hindus. For example, Munshi Premchand is a shining example. Gopi Chand Narang till more recently. Urdu was amply spoken in undivided India.
What are the languages they speak today? English, obviously?
Yeah, I mean, India has close to 100 odd languages. So every little state has its own language. Maharashtra has Marathi, Gujarat has Gujarati. It's a melting pot.
Where did you live?
I was born in Delhi and brought up in Bombay. And then I came to study communications and writing in England in 96. And then, I just stayed.
You stayed in England, and you're going and coming with India.
Yes. Every year, my wife and I go. We've got family there. My parents are there. My two daughters are there, although now they're embarking on their own careers. But so India is still a very, very integral part.
And Mumbai is now your place. Yeah. I mean, your family.
That's right.
Central place. And obviously, as a writer, you are published in India and in the UK and US as well. Now, you start being a non-fiction writer, right?
That's right.
And then lately, a few months ago in England and a year ago in India, you published a book called The Last Fragrance of Infinity, which instead is a novel, right?
That's right.
So are you going now to be a novelist and leaving nonfiction, or you will be both? What is your intention? And what is the difference for you between writing fiction and nonfiction?
I always saw myself as a nonfiction writer. The first two books that I wrote, the first one was co-authored with my father, where we translated the Urdu and Persian poetry of Mirza Ghalib, who was India's finest Urdu poet of the 19th century. We translated his works into English. The second book was, again, non-fiction, as you mentioned, which was about the rise of the British East India Company in Western India and the story of an Indian prince who takes them on in the House of Commons. And I always believed that I would be a non-fiction writer. But I was consumed for nearly, a year and a half or two to write something about Sufism. And I very quickly realized that if I wrote a non-fiction book on Sufism, it would be confined only to the archives. It would be confined to probably someone who was interested in a form of philosophy and would pick it up only when he or she had to do research. But I wanted it to be a story that I could, through the lens of a particular human being, show the philosophy of Sufism. And as I worked with my publishers on this concept, the one thing that they came back to me time and time again was, you have to write this and address this as a novel. Initially, there was a lot of resistance from my part. Eventually, I realized that what they were saying was correct. And that's how I got into writing this book as a novel. What is ahead for me in the future? I believe it will be nonfiction. In fact, the book that I'm working on is nonfiction.
Well, let's talk about this book and let's talk about Sufi. I mean, Sufi is something that comes from your grandfather, right? The teaching of Sufi to you. Sufi is obviously a word that many people are aware of, right? But probably not many people exactly know what it means to be a Sufi, right? To be a Sufi is a very sophisticated philosophy, or whatever you want to call, or the Muslim philosophy of the Muslim world, right? But if you can explain with your very words what Sufi is for you, and why did you want to write about it?
Yeah.
And how do you write about it in a novel?
Yeah, you are right. It is a word which takes a fair bit of understanding. For whatever it's worth, I still am learning more about it. I still read and I still try and understand it. I think it's also used rather loosely, the word Sufi. And the one thing that irked me, if I may say so, is that arguably one of the finest Sufi philosophers and poets, Jalaluddin Rumi, for example, in America, he's seen as some hippie poet that is sung by Madonna, and he's become a part of a pop culture. Whereas Rumi was a far deeper thinker. He was a deeply philosophical man. And I very quickly realized that the only aspect of Sufism that people would relate to was probably a WhatsApp message of a particular Rumi saying, which it wasn't even his saying. Or people would say, I've been to Turkey and Istanbul and I've seen the whirling dervish, the dance, the whirling dervish, and I know what Sufism is. And it was so irksome to me that I flung myself into studying and restudying the works of my grandfather and to really understand what was the philosophy of Sufism. To put it succinctly, which is a very difficult task, but nevertheless, I'll make an attempt. Sufi is the mystical side of Islam. It is about understanding what is creation, the oneness of this creator and how you are part of that one creator through an inward perspective and an inward esoteric journey. Now, that would obviously then manifest itself into various different forms where man starts understanding his relationship to science, his understanding his relationship to mathematics, which is what Omar Khayyam did so brilliantly. And that brought about a sense of curiosity to know the unseen, to know the super sort of creative force that has put all of these things in order.
So how do you put all this into a novel? What is the protagonist of the novel searching?
As I said, and very quickly I realized that if I was to write something academic about the philosophy of Ibn Arabi or the philosophy of Hafiz or the philosophy of Rumi, it would be confined to the archives. So I decided to create a character who is immersed in Sufi craftsmanship, which is tile making. So if you see the tile trail all the way from the Alhambra, so my character is a craftsman who's a tile maker. And so if you see the tile trail that exists all the way from the Alhambra and Andalusia, you see it in Istanbul, you see it in Izmir, then you will see it in Samarkand, you will see it in Delhi. And the geometric perfection of those Islamic tiles are absolutely fantastic.
What does it have to do with Sufi?
What comes to light during my research is that a lot of these craftsmen were actually inspired by Sufi philosophical thought. And a large number of the khanqahs of the Sufis, which were the retreats, were the places where these tiles were made. And some of the finest Sufis, for example, the Chishti order, or for the matter, even the order of Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi that is in Konya, have these tile makers till date actually making these fantastic tiles. And as I was talking to a particular Sufi in Bursa, which is a small town in Anatolia, which used to be the capital of the Ottoman Empire, I had the most extraordinary experience. So I walk into the Yes Al-Kami Mosque, which is by far the finest example of geometric tile work. And I see this man sitting outside and I get talking to him. I'm cutting the long story short. He happens to be a practicing Sufi. And he tells me, look at these geometric tiles. And what do you see? And I said, well, I see a square, I see a triangle, I see a hexagon, all beautifully crafted. And he says, no, look deeper. And I didn't have an answer. And he said, look, these are the different shapes of mankind. This is a different race. This is a different creed. This is the different races of mankind all coming together. And right in the middle is the star of enlightenment. So if we interlock as mankind together, we will be an enlightened lot. And that just completely blew me away. Because if you see the pattern of these geometric tiles, you will have the star in the middle. And then you'll have all the geometric patterns around it. And then they repeat this design time and time and again. So it becomes the pattern of infinity or the design of infinity or the tiles of infinity. And
this is a religious practice?
No, not at all. It's an art. It's a craft.
When you said he was a Sufi, what does it mean?
Well, a practicing Sufi is someone who's devoted to God, who is a theologian, who understands the philosophy of the likes of Ibn Arabi and who understands the philosophy of Rumi and of Nizamuddin Aulia and puts that into practice in terms of worship. From there emerges the curiosity towards science, towards art and architecture. And this particular craft is just a manifestation of that. So that's what it is.
But Sufis are a sophisticated branch of the Sunnis, if I'm not wrong.
You are absolutely right.
So you can become a Sufi or you can convert to be a Sufi, or you born like that and that's the way it is. I mean, you are a Sufi.
Well, I'm not a Sufi. My grandfather was a practicing Sufi. I'm deeply influenced by it, but it takes a lot of discipline to become a Sufi. And I'm by far nowhere close to being a Sufi. I'm just very deeply influenced by it because I've seen it influence my life as a child. But firstly, in Islam, there is nothing like Sunni and Shia. It is a creation after the death of Ali. It didn't really actually pan out that way. It was not supposed to be that way. The Sufis, by and large, are Sunni, but you go into any Sufi shrine or you go into any Sufi tariqat, the concept of Sunni and Shia dissolves. It is about man and God. It is about your relationship with yourself, and it is about how you can better yourself under the banner of being a thoughtful Muslim.
But you still pray in a mosque, you still say the same prayers,
they do.
You still practice the Quran.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I was trying to say. With regards to Rumi, his actual title is Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi. He was a Maulana. He was a practicing Muslim. He was a practicing preacher, if I can use that word. What made him different, what makes the Sufis different, is that they are an exceptionally curious lot, driven to innovation and driven by the joy of experiencing beauty through curiosity and being creative.
And what happens to this character who does these exceptional tiles in the book, The Lost Fragments of Infinity?
Well, the book actually starts with his life in Delhi. And it's at the twilight of three fading empires. The Mughal Empire is sinking in India in 1739. That's when the book is set. The Safavids in Persia have already declined dramatically. And the Ottomans are showing signs of retreating. They've lost Belgrade, they've lost Budapest, and they're retreating. So these three ginormous empires that span from Belgrade to Bengal are retreating, are diminishing in luster, if you wish. And so the protagonist finds himself in Delhi. He's influenced by an enormous amount of Sufi poets that actually existed in Delhi in 1739. And it's amazing that when an empire actually sinks, that's when a cultural effervescence really does stand out. And that's what's happening in Delhi in 1739. Nadir Shah, who's the king of Persia, invades his peaceful life and shatters. And I use that invasion and I use the massacre of Delhi, where 30,000 people were put to the sword by Nadir Shah, as a metaphor for him to go within and rebuild his life through travel. And because of a particular incident, he flees Delhi, equipped with this skill of tile making that a Sufi teaches him. And he makes his way into Samarkand. And from there, he finds himself in Andalusia.
So your travels are inspiration for this kind of writing. Now, said that these are your past books, and you said that you want to go back to nonfiction. And if I understand well, you have on works 2 different projects.
Yes.
That you are working on for new books. So can you please tell me something about this new project, or they are secrets?
Well, both of them are a bit secretive between me and the publisher, but I can let you into one of them. There was a fabulous Roman philosopher with an Egyptian and Greek heritage. His name was Plotinus, and he lived in the 3rd century in Rome. His greatest desire was to visit India and study Indian philosophy. And he attaches himself with the Roman army. I forget the name of the Roman emperor back then. And the idea is to defeat Persia, and then he could make his way to India. But unfortunately, he has to retreat. But he is so deeply influenced by Aristotle, Plato, that he pens a book called the Enneads. And so I'm writing a travel book, and I'm in his footsteps, traveling through Egypt, through Greece, through Rome. And I hope to fulfill his dream of taking him to India. And through his journey, I hope to show the beauty of his writing.
How do you do that?
Firstly, the most important thing is to read his work. It is absolutely fantastic what he wrote. It is by far one of the most astonishing pieces of philosophical work that I have read till now. He has basically Neoplatonism is because of Plotinus. He's taken Plato and he's refined his thought to such an extent that it is readable and relatable. So, of course, it's reading his work and then traveling in his footsteps and understanding his work in terms of art and architecture and understanding his concept in today's day-to-day exchanges. So his basic concept is that there is only one creator, and it is called the One. So I'm looking at the concept of the One and unity, and how does it bring about the best or the worst in mankind.
But this concept of the One is the basis of the monotheistic thinking. So the Christians, the Jews, they have more or less the same idea, right?
That's
of
right.
The One.
That's right.
This was more rare at the time of the Romans.
Yes. And I think what is fascinating is that Plotinus, whatever I've been going through, it doesn't claim to be Christian, but his writing of the One is so compelling, and when you juxtapose it against the times that he was living in, you can see how Rome eventually becomes Christian, because he has this fertile mind and it's all being cross-pollinated in his mind. The more he's reading, the more he's understanding. And I'm sure Christian thought has penetrated his mind at that time. So it's fascinating to put yourself in his footsteps and in his thoughts.
By what you say, it seems that you kind of mix together poetry, philosophy, history, traveling, as if it was one thing. And eventually the sidelines of it. For instance, you talked before about Sufi and said one of the aspects were mathematics or geometry, but that's also Pythagoras, right?
Of course,
I mean, the Greek philosopher.
Of course. The Sufi thought is inspired deeply by Greek philosophy. Ibn Arabi, who is considered the greatest sheikh and who is head and shoulders above basically any Sufi, was deeply influenced by Aristotle and Plato. So Greek philosophy has influenced the Sufis enormously. And the Greeks' foray into mathematics and science inspired them to push the limits even further. So,
Observing the world of today, the Islam of today, the India of today, the Western world where you spend part of your life, what remains of all this? I mean, because your travels are true and imaginary travels in a very past period, right?
Yeah.
I mean, today people travel a lot, but the world is very much different. What remains of this in the world of today? How do you position yourself in the middle of this? Your work is a reminder, is a metaphor of what is going on today.
Yes, to anyone who's sensitive or anyone who takes a bit of a, I don't want to use the word detached, but anyone who pulls back and looks at what's happening, it's absolutely catastrophical. The way mankind is plunged in despair and violence. But at the same time, I look at the concept of unity and I look at the concept of one, and I look at this particular concept that has come down from generations. It was Abraham, or it was Moses, or it was Aristotle, or Plato, or Christ, or Muhammad. I try and look at them as philosophers rather than people who brought in religion. I mean, of course, Aristotle and Plato were there, but if you strip religion out of them and you look at them purely from a philosophical point of view, the message that they brought was pretty much the same about the oneness. What remains, to answer that particular part of your question, I think a lot of despair remains, but at the same time, there is a fair bit of hope. And I'd like to just elaborate a little bit on this. So I put on my television set and I hear the most jarring voice of Vladimir Putin saying, Ukrainians and the Russians are one people. And in the name of that oneness, or that one unity, or that one identity of a humanness, if you wish, he unleashes hell. He unleashes devastation. He unleashes war. On the other hand, a year ago, I'm sitting in front of my television set and I put on CNN, and there is a fantastic voice that crackles through. It's the spaceship landing on Mars. And the voice that is crackling through, that is giving the signal to a machine that is billions of miles away to land on another planet named after a Roman god, is a woman with an Indian accent. As the camera turns and you look at the NASA headquarters, you see an Indian scientist, a Chinese scientist, a French scientist, an American scientist, and a British scientist at the head of Project Mars, landing a machine there which is going to begin its journey on another heavenly body. That's an example of mankind coming together as one and excelling with such degree that it can dazzle your mind. So does the one inject a sense of majoritarianism? Does it inject a certain sense of othering a minority? Does it inject a certain sense of superiority? But can it also inject us as mankind to come together and harness a whole new heavenly body?
You were raised, you said, in Delhi and Mumbai in India. I don't know if India is a country or a continent or a world in itself, right? It's a huge world.
Yeah.
With so many contradictions and differences on every level, religious, social, language, as you said, landscape. It's a world.
Yeah.
So in the world of today, we talk a lot about America, we talk a lot about Russia vis-a-vis Europe, especially a lot about China. India, which is so big and important, is kind of mysterious in the world of today, right? We don't really understand, or maybe some people understand, what is India today. This very, very old world, but in the same time, many of the most extraordinary engineers in technology or doctors in very sophisticated modern are Indians.
Yes.
So can you explain a little bit, or do you want to explain it, or do you try to explain it in your books?
Alain, I think it's almost impossible to explain India. It's a country that bedazzles one with such splendor. This is the country that gave the world the Upanishads. Unimpeachably, one of the greatest philosophies that came out nearly 300 BC. This is 2,500, 3,000 BC, Upanishads, which when Dara Shikoh, the Mughal emperor, read it, he said, this is a philosophy that every human being should read. So anyway, so that is how ancient India is in its grand sweep of history, which dates back that long that we were talking about, nearly 7,000 years. And it's a living, breathing civilization even now. The layer upon layer upon layer of history that you see is just unimaginable. You see the beauty of Hinduism, you see the beauty of Buddhism, you see the beauty of Islam, you see the beauty of Christianity in Goa. And it's taken it all within its realm and come out with such beauty. But yes, of course, it's plagued with enormous problems. The population, the pollution, the economic strife, the caste system that still prevails in India.
That is still there.
Yeah. So, India has never been a monolith. It's always been a country that people love, that people enjoy. And at the same time, it has its own contradictions. It has its own enormous problems, which I just accounted for. But they are not flashes of genius, but they are sustained moments in history when India has pulled its weight quite brilliantly. It rode the technology wave about 20 years ago, when no other country could necessarily do that. Today, there's a possibility of an Indian becoming Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The Vice President of America has Indian origin. So India, in many ways, in its soft power, is making its presence felt, whether it's in NASA, or it's in the political echelons of Britain, or it's in the House of Commons, or it's in the Congress in America. Indians are not just pulling their weight, but they're making their presence felt. To define India or to be able to explain India is next to impossible. It's an emotion, it's a feeling, it's a color, it's love, it's pandemonium, it's all of that.
But there is a phenomenon which is rather interesting, because you are a writer in the English language. And this happens also maybe in the French language. Many English writers are from India, Pakistan, or other countries, right? I mean, you became English literature,
yes,
English writers,
yes,
and you bring your world into the English language, more or less, right?
Yeah.
That's a new, very interesting phenomenon.
Yes, and I think South Asian writers, as you rightly mentioned, Indian, Pakistani, even Bangladeshi writers,
right,
are putting across literature which is not just rich in terms of thought, but it is also rich in terms of sharing. Our work is work through which we share our culture, our experiences. And through our written work, or through some of our brilliant filmmakers, we are able to bring not just a bit of exotic East, but a sense of this is who we are, this is what we think, this is what we have thought in the past, this is what we are thinking now. And that encourages cross-pollination of thought in Western society. As I keep saying, where in the world would you have a mayor of London, Sajid Javid, origins in Pakistan. Then we've got Rishi Sunak and all of that. And this is happening because the West is also reading us. It's understanding us. It's thinking about us because of our literature, our poetry, our painting. And we're coming in quite boldly, I think.
It is interesting that people from so many different upbringing and history and write in the same language, use the same language.
Yeah.
Were you never tempted to write in one of the other languages?
Very much so. But I think that's a bit of the colonial heritage that has left its indelible mark on Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Britain left us with the heritage of writing in English. But Might I very quickly hasten to add here that there are some fantastic writers who continue to write in Urdu and continue to write in Persian and continue to write in Hindi. In fact, the kind of work that is coming out from these languages is brilliant. It's just that I happen to go to an English school. My schooling was in Mumbai, and I happened to have an education in an English school, and then happened to come to England and study. But there is literature that is coming out in these native languages, but you obviously won't get to read them because they don't get translated that often into English or in French or in Italian.
There has been an interesting Israeli literature. They write in Hebrew.
Yes.
Then they are translated
Beautiful.
in other, but mainly they write about their experience in Israel. What always puzzled me is, are you ever going to write about a story that takes place in Paris between a French and a German person, forgetting the fact that you are Indian, right? Just to write a story or something obliges you to go back to your own country and roots.
A third of The Lost Fragrance of Infinity is in Spain. And the last 3 chapters are about this young man's life in Spain and how he manages to build a life in Spain. So, of course, those aspects will be there. But for me to write a love story between a French man and a German lady, for example, it could happen, but I don't think I would have necessarily that language. And I have to admit, I won't have that language.
So at the end of the day, what you want to say is that one cannot write something he doesn't know deeply, who is not his own.
No, the former part of your statement is right. I think it would be inauthentic if someone wrote something that he didn't know or didn't experience or didn't have a very intimate relationship with. I think that's quite right.
And
actually.
Being Sufi, being Indian, and this is a delicate question, what do you feel about all this constant threat of war, terrorism, problems that exist in your very country, in Afghanistan, in Iran, in the Arab world, in Pakistan, in India, and the terrorism that comes into Europe and America. How do you feel vis-a-vis that?
Oh, it's appalling. It's a great tragedy. It brings me to a point of despair because when you see the beauty of Sufism, when you experience that beauty, when you immerse yourself in that beauty, when you read the works of Bokhlus Mustafa, a great Sufi who said, treat Christians like angels. When you read Rumi's poetry, when you read the fact that when Rumi passed away and he died, the people to lead his funeral were Greek Orthodox Christians. When they asked a Jew who was carrying Rumi's body for burial and the Islamic rites were being read, they asked him, they said, what do you have to do with this man? And he said, this man was bread and I was hungry. Have you ever seen a man run away from bread? It's tragedy, what's happening in our world. It's tragic. It drives me to despair.
So what is the position of a writer?
I think the writer mirrors his times. He has to show what is happening in his times, and he has to be that mirror. And he has to leave the reader with a soulful question at the end that strikes so deep that you shatter every possible wall of hatred. And at least me as a writer, that's what I hope to do, and try to bring people together. At the end of reading my book, if a reader puts it down and goes within and questions himself or questions even day-to-day politics and really tries to understand as to why hatred prevails over good time and time again. And he questions his actions on a day-to-day basis.
That has happened since the very beginning of the world, in a way.
We got to keep doing that, I think. We got to keep doing that. Because, Alain, when I was writing my proposal for this upcoming book, I was sitting in the London library and I was actually just looking out of the window. I had finished the first draft and I was doing nothing. I said, I'm going to do something else. And there was a magazine in front of me, which I think was Scientific America or something, I'm not sure. And I flipped through the pages and I saw this image. It's called the pale blue dot. Google it when you get the time. We sent out the Voyager spacecrafts in the 1970s. Anyways, there was a great astronomer called Carl Sagan who was at the forefront of that. And in 1972 or 3, if I'm not mistaken, as the Voyager was leaving the solar system, he commanded it to turn around and take a picture of the Earth. The final, last picture of the Earth that would be taken by the Voyager as it left. And it shook me, that picture. We are nothing but a pale blue dot. And that photograph is something that I think every human being should frame and keep in his house and see it every morning.
What is pushing you to be a writer? What is the aim? Why did you devoted your life to be a writer? What happened?
I think the first thing is...
In this little blue dot that you were talking about.
To understand, actually not to understand, because Plotinus says unlearn and unknow, because that's the only way you can learn. It's a deeper thought. But I think what pushes me is to write things that I feel which will bring people together. It's as simple as that.
So you want to bring people together?
Yeah. I believe the influence of writers in India is seeing new life. I don't live in India on a day-to-day basis, but I do visit India every year for a couple of weeks. And what I learn is that there is a resurgence to read good quality literature, particularly in nonfiction. So you are seeing scholars coming out and putting their work out quite confidently. And I think the emergence of some very interesting publishing houses is giving encouragement to young writers to write and to not be afraid to put their manuscripts out. What is also of great importance is some really good quality literature festivals that are coming up in India. For example, the Jaipur Literature Festival is one of the largest literature festivals in the world. In Kolkata, there's a literature festival which is brilliant. And so those literature festivals are becoming the media vehicles, if you wish, for writers to get out there, to put their word out there, to get youngsters into a festival, to engage with writers. So that is happening, but not as much as it should. We need literature festivals literally in every town in India to get that kind of influence that writers have. And I feel a lot more work needs to be done.
So thank you very much for telling me all this.
Thank you.
There is still a secret, which is the second book you're writing.
Yes.
And good luck for this book. When it will be finished and published?
Well, we are looking at mid next year.
You have a title?
I do.
Is it a secret? Yes.
It is, unfortunately.
Is it going to be published in England first or in India?
I would suspect simultaneously, but usually they first come out in India and then.
Thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alain.
Good luck.
Alain Elkann interviews.